Here's the introduction to your YouTube video story. The courtroom was silent. Every eye in the room was fixed on the young boy standing in the middle, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. 14-year-old Malik Johnson wasn't supposed to be here. He wasn't supposed to be standing in front of a judge, accused of a crime he didn't commit. But here he was, alone, scared, and staring into the cold, unfeeling eyes of Judge Randall Pierce. Malik had always been taught to respect authority, to believe that the justice system existed to protect the innocent. But that belief was slipping away with every second that passed. His heart pounded as he turned his gaze toward the jury, searching for any sign of fairness, of someone who saw the truth. But their faces were blank, just like the judge's. The evidence against him was weak, barely enough to warrant a trial. But it didn't seem to matter. It felt like the decision had already been made before he even walked into the room. Judge Pierce had a reputation, one that people whispered about but never dared to challenge. He had a history of coming down hard on young black boys, handing out harsh sentences for minor offenses, twisting facts to fit his version of justice. And now Malik was his next target. The judge leaned forward, his voice steady, almost rehearsed. "You've been accused of robbery and resisting arrest," he said, his tone dripping with authority. "The evidence points to your guilt." Malik's breath hitched. What evidence? A grainy security camera clip of someone in a hoodie. A witness who admitted they weren't sure what they saw. The truth was clear. Malik was innocent. But the judge wasn't interested in the truth. The public defender assigned to Malik had barely fought for him, brushing off his side of the story. His pleas, his alibi, his truth, it all felt invisible. The officer who arrested him hadn't even bothered to ask questions. He had just thrown Malik against the hood of the car, slapped the cuffs on him, and decided he was guilty. Now the judge was about to do the same. Malik swallowed hard, his mind racing. He had one option left, one name that could change everything. He hadn't wanted to play this card. He wanted to believe that justice could work the way it was supposed to. But the fear in his chest told him otherwise. He took a deep breath and lifted his chin. "I want my phone call," he said firmly. Judge Pierce smirked. "And who exactly do you plan to call?" Malik didn't hesitate. He met the judge's gaze and said, "My mom." The judge let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. "And what exactly is your mother going to do for you, son?" Malik's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "She's the U.S. Attorney General." The courtroom shifted. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The bailiff's grip on Malik's arm loosened. The prosecutor's confident expression flickered with uncertainty. And for the first time since the trial began, Judge Pierce hesitated. Malik could see it, the sudden realization in the judge's eyes. The understanding that this wasn't just another case where he could twist the system to his will. That this wasn't just another black kid he could throw away without consequence. This was something different. This was someone different. Silence filled the room. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. And just like that, the game had changed. The judge's smirk faded as the weight of Malik's words settled over the room. For a second, it seemed like the whole courthouse had frozen. Eyes darted between the boy and the judge, waiting for what would happen next. Malik's heart pounded in his chest, but he kept his face steady. He wasn't sure if what he just said would make things better or worse, but he knew it was his only shot. Judge Pierce shifted in his chair, clearing his throat. "That's quite the claim," he said, trying to sound unimpressed. But there was something different in his voice now, a crack in the confidence he'd carried throughout the whole trial. Malik glanced around the courtroom. He could see the prosecutor scribbling something down on a yellow legal pad, glancing up at him with narrowed eyes. The bailiff shifted his stance, suddenly unsure if he should be holding Malik so tightly. The people in the back row leaned forward, their curiosity piqued. Malik's mom had always told him to speak with confidence, no matter how scared he felt. "People will try to take your voice away," she would say. "Don't let them." Those words echoed in his mind now, giving him the courage to keep going. "Her name's Angela Johnson," Malik said, his voice steady. "You can look her up." The judge's eyes flicked toward the prosecutor, then back at Malik. For a second, Malik thought he saw something like fear flash across his face. But it was gone just as quickly, replaced by that cold, practiced expression. "We'll verify your claim," Judge Pierce said, trying to regain control. "But it doesn't change the evidence in front of us." Malik clenched his fists. He wanted to scream, to tell them again that he was innocent. But he knew that wouldn't help. The truth wasn't enough in this room, not when the system was already stacked against him. The whispers in the courtroom grew louder. People were starting to realize this case might not be as simple as they'd thought. Some of them had come here expecting another open and shut conviction. Another young black kid caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. But now there was a crack in the story. And once a crack appears, it's only a matter of time before the whole thing starts to crumble. Malik's mind raced back to the night he was arrested. He had been walking home from basketball practice, earbuds in, listening to his favorite playlist. It was late, but he had walked that route 100 times before. The corner store had been robbed just minutes before he passed by. And the next thing he knew, flashing lights filled the street. The cop didn't ask where he was coming from. He didn't ask if Malik had seen anything. He just grabbed him, shoved him against the squad car, and started barking orders. Malik had tried to explain, but no one was listening. They didn't care that he had no stolen goods, no weapon, not even $1 in his pockets. All they saw was a black kid in a hoodie, and that was enough. Now, standing in the middle of the courtroom, Malik could still feel the cold metal of the handcuffs against his wrists. He could still hear the officer's voice telling him to shut up when he tried to speak. The judge leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "We'll take a recess while we verify this information," he announced. The gavel came down with a sharp crack, but the noise couldn't hide the nervous energy crackling through the room. Malik felt the bailiff's grip on his arm loosen even more before letting go altogether. Malik sat down at the defense table, his heart still racing. His public defender leaned over, finally looking more interested than he had the whole trial. "Is it true?" the lawyer whispered. Malik just nodded. He wasn't sure if the man believed him or if he was just hoping for a headline. Either way, it didn't matter. Malik knew what would happen next. His mom would pick up the phone. She always did. And when she heard what was happening, the whole game would change. But even that thought didn't make him feel safe. He had seen too much already. How quickly the system could twist the truth, how easily people in power could look the other way. Just because his mom had a title didn't mean justice was guaranteed. He glanced toward the judge's bench, catching Judge Pierce's eye for a split second. The man looked away, pretending to shuffle papers. Malik's stomach twisted. He could feel it. The judge was trying to figure out how to cover his tracks. The minutes ticked by. Every second felt like an hour. The courtroom stayed half empty during the recess, but the air was thick with tension. Malik could see people typing on their phones, probably looking up his mom's name. The prosecutor kept glancing at the door, like he was waiting for someone to walk in with answers. Finally, the bailiff stepped back into the room, whispering something to the judge. Pierce's face paled just slightly, but he covered it quickly. He banged his gavel again, calling the court back into session. After verifying the defendant's claim, the judge began, his voice even but tight. We have confirmed that his mother is indeed Angela Johnson, U.S. Attorney General. A murmur swept through the crowd again. Malik could feel the shift. People were paying attention now. But the judge wasn't about to let go of his power that easily. This information, however, does not exempt the defendant from the charges brought against him. Judge Pierce added quickly, his eyes locked on Malik. Malik's heart sank. He knew it wouldn't be that simple. The system wasn't built to bend just because someone powerful was watching. If anything, it made people like Judge Pierce dig their heels in even harder. But Malik wasn't backing down either. He sat up straighter in his chair, his jaw clenched. His mom always told him that truth had a way of coming out, even in places where people tried to bury it. The judge glanced at the clock, then at the prosecutor. He was stalling, trying to figure out his next move. Malik could feel it, the cracks in the story getting wider. But he also knew something else. Just because the truth was starting to show didn't mean justice would follow. Not yet. The courtroom was still holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. And Malik was right there with them, trapped between fear and hope, praying that this time someone would finally listen. Malik sat perfectly still, his body tense as he listened to Judge Pierce's words. The room felt colder now, even though nothing had changed physically. The judge was still in control, still holding all the power, and Malik could see that he wasn't going to give it up without a fight. Just because his mother's name carried weight didn't mean the system was suddenly going to work in his favor. He knew better than that. Judge Pierce adjusted his robe, his face carefully neutral, but Malik could see something else just beneath the surface, something uneasy, something calculating. The judge was thinking, searching for a way to keep control of the situation. The presence of the U.S. Attorney General in this case does not change the facts, the judge continued. The law must be applied equally, no matter who is involved. The words sounded good, sounded fair, but Malik wasn't fooled. That wasn't what had been happening in this courtroom before he said his mother's name. He had been treated as if he were already guilty, as if his innocence didn't even matter. And now that things weren't going exactly the way Judge Pierce expected, he was scrambling to make it look like he was just doing his job. Malik's public defender cleared his throat and finally spoke up. Your Honor, given this new information, I request that the charges be re-examined with fresh eyes. There are clear inconsistencies in the prosecution's case. The judge looked at the prosecutor as if giving him a silent cue to push back. The prosecutor, a man in his 40s with sharp eyes and an even sharper suit, didn't miss a beat. We stand by our case, Your Honor, he said, flipping through his papers. The defendant was found near the scene of the crime, wearing similar clothing to the suspect in the security footage. He also resisted arrest. Malik almost laughed at that. He hadn't resisted anything. He had been confused, scared, and completely caught off guard. But that was always how they framed it, wasn't it? If you hesitated, if you asked a single question, if you so much as flinched when they grabbed you, they called it resisting. He clenched his fists under the table, feeling his nails press into his palms. He wouldn't let them twist the story. Not this time. My client was walking home from basketball practice, the public defender countered, flipping through his notes. And I'd like to remind the court that the so-called security footage is grainy and indistinct. The suspect's face is not visible. There is no direct evidence linking Mr. Johnson to this crime. Judge Pierce exhaled sharply through his nose. Malik could tell he was getting impatient. He wanted this over with. He wanted Malik convicted and out of his courtroom before things got more complicated. Malik looked over at the jury. Some of them seemed to be paying attention now, actually thinking about what was being said. A few had skeptical expressions, as if they were beginning to question things. That was new. That hadn't been there before. And then the door at the back of the courtroom opened. A tall, powerful woman in a navy blue suit walked in, her heels clicking against the floor with purpose. The air shifted. People turned. Angela Johnson had arrived. Malik felt his chest tighten. His mom's face was unreadable, but he could feel the weight of her presence. She walked with confidence, her posture straight, her expression controlled, but Malik knew her well enough to see the fire in her eyes. Judge Pierce stiffened, his fingers tightening slightly on his gavel. He knew exactly who she was. He knew that this case had just become a lot bigger than he had anticipated. Angela took a seat in the gallery, crossing her legs, her eyes locked onto the judge. She didn't say a word, but she didn't have to. Her presence alone was enough to make people uneasy. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably. The jury stole glances at her. The tension in the room doubled. Judge Pierce cleared his throat. "I assume you are here as an observer, Ms. Johnson." Angela smiled politely, but there was an unmistakable sharpness to it. "I'm here to ensure that my son receives a fair trial," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Something I'm not convinced has been happening." A beat of silence. Malik's heart pounded. The judge forced a thin smile. "I can assure you that we are conducting this trial with complete fairness." Angela tilted her head slightly, as if she found that interesting. She didn't respond right away, and the silence stretched, making everyone just a little more uncomfortable. Then she turned her gaze toward the prosecutor. "I'd like to see the full evidence against my son," she said. Now, the prosecutor's face drained of color. Judge Pierce stiffened. Malik could feel the shift in the air, the undeniable sense that something huge was about to happen. Angela walked forward, handing over a thick file. "This is the full forensic analysis of the security footage, including the real suspect's confession. It proves beyond any doubt that Malik Johnson was not involved in this crime. He was framed, and now we know why." The tension snapped like a wire pulled too tight. The judge's face was stone cold, but Malik could see the way his jaw clenched. He was losing control of the courtroom, and he knew it. Collins took a step forward. "Your Honor, we have also gathered substantial evidence of judicial misconduct related to this case, including direct communication between Judge Pierce and law enforcement officials who manipulated evidence to ensure a conviction." The air went still. The judge gripped the edge of his bench. "That is a serious accusation, Agent Collins." Collins didn't blink. "That's why we came prepared." He turned and nodded toward the agents. One of them walked up to the bench, handing over a separate folder. "Judge Pierce," the agent said calmly, "you are under investigation for conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and misconduct." The room exploded into chaos. Reporters shouted questions. The prosecutor stepped back, looking as if he wanted to disappear. Judge Pierce's face turned a deep shade of red. You can't be serious." His voice was tight, but for the first time, Malik saw something in his eyes. Panic. Angela crossed her arms. "Oh, we are." The judge shot to his feet. "This is outrageous. This entire trial is a farce." Collins didn't move. "Then you won't mind stepping outside with us to discuss it further." The silence that followed was deafening. The judge's gaze flickered around the room. He was looking for a way out, a way to regain control. But it was too late. The agent stepped forward. He had no choice. With a clenched jaw, he slowly removed his robe and placed it on the bench. The agents cuffed him. The courtroom watched in stunned silence as Judge Pierce was let out the very same doors he had walked through with authority just minutes before. Malik let out a shaky breath. It was over. or so he thought. As the judge disappeared, the prosecutor suddenly stood, shuffling papers in a rushed motion. Given these developments, the state withdraws its case against Malik Johnson. Relief flooded through Malik's body. Angela put a hand on his shoulder, squeezing it gently. The weight he had been carrying for weeks, the fear, the uncertainty, it was all lifting. But then Agent Collins turned to Angela with a look that sent a chill through the air. "There's one more thing," he said. Angela frowned. "What?" Collins hesitated for only a second before sliding one last file across the table. Angela opened it, her expression shifting instantly. Her breath hitched and her fingers tightened around the paper. Malik leaned over to read it, his stomach twisting. The case against him wasn't just about corruption. It was personal. Judge Pierce had a long history with Angela. Years ago, before she became the U.S. Attorney General, she had prosecuted a case that cost him everything. A case that revealed unethical practices that nearly got him disbarred. He had never forgotten, and when the opportunity arose, he took it. This wasn't just about power. It was revenge. Angela shut the file, her expression unreadable. But Malik could see it now, clearer than ever, the cost of standing up for justice. The price of challenging the system. Collins exhaled. He wanted to ruin your son's life because you ruined his. Angela didn't respond right away. She simply looked at Malik, her eyes soft but steady. "Then it's a good thing we don't break easily." The courtroom was still spinning with murmurs, the media scrambling to process what had just happened. But Malik didn't hear them anymore. He was free. And more than that, he finally understood. This wasn't just his story. It was the story of so many others who had been silenced, who had been wronged by a system that was supposed to protect them. And now, he and his mother had exposed it. When they arrived at the house, Angela wasted no time. She pulled out her laptop, her phone, and several legal pads covered in notes. Malik watched as she immediately got to work, calling contacts, reviewing case files, analyzing every single piece of evidence. "Come here," she said, motioning for him to sit beside her. She pulled up the surveillance footage on her laptop. Malik had seen it before, but now, sitting next to his mother, he saw it differently. The figure in the video was moving fast, wearing dark clothes, their face obscured by a hood. The quality was terrible, grainy, the movements blurry. Malik felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. How had they looked at this and thought it was him? Angela slowed the video down, her eyes sharp as she examined every detail. Then she froze the screen. "Look at the shoes," she said. Malik leaned in, his brow furrowed. The person in the video was wearing dark sneakers, ones with a thick, distinct white stripe along the side. Malik looked down at his own shoes. He had been wearing his basketball sneakers that night. They were completely different. Angela exhaled, her mind already working. "They never looked closely," she said, "or they didn't want to." She reached for her phone and dialed a number. Malik couldn't hear the person on the other end, but when they answered, Angela's tone was sharp and clear. "This case is built on nothing," she said. "I want a full forensic analysis on this footage immediately." Malik didn't know who she was talking to, but whoever it was, they responded quickly. His mother nodded, said a few more things, and then hung up. She turned back to Malik. "We're going to prove this, piece by piece," she said. "But you have to be ready. They're not going to let this go easily." Malik felt his stomach twist. He knew she was right. Judge Pierce hadn't wanted to back down, and the prosecutor had been determined to push this case forward, no matter how weak it was. And something told Malik that they weren't done trying. The next morning, they were back in court. This time, his mother sat directly behind him, her presence impossible to ignore. The judge took his seat, his expression carefully neutral, but there was something tight about his jaw. "We are prepared to proceed," the prosecutor announced. Angela stood. "Before we continue, I have new evidence to present," she said, her voice steady, unwavering. The room shifted. The judge's eyes narrowed slightly. The prosecutor hesitated. Malik felt his heartbeat hammer against his ribs. This was it. Angela reached for her folder, her movements precise. "This footage," she said, holding up a document, "has already been sent for independent forensic review. And what we found changes everything." The tension in the room crackled. Malik braced himself. The fight wasn't over yet. But for the first time, he felt like they might actually have a chance. The courtroom fell into an eerie silence as Angela held up the document. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably, his lips pressing into a thin line. Judge Pierce adjusted his glasses, his fingers drumming lightly against the bench. Malik could feel his heart pounding in his chest, each beat heavy with anticipation. Angela took a deep breath before speaking. "We submitted the surveillance footage for forensic analysis. What we found was undeniable. The person in this video is not my son." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The prosecutor cleared his throat, his face unreadable. "That is a bold claim, Ms. Johnson. Do you have evidence to support it?" Angela didn't blink. She reached into her folder and pulled out a printed analysis report. "The suspect in the video is at least 2 inches taller than Malik. The build is different. And most importantly," she paused, flipping to another page, "the shoes. The suspect is wearing a distinct Brandon model that Malik has never owned. We have receipts to prove what he was wearing that night, and they do not match." The judge leaned forward slightly. His expression was still hard to read, but there was a flicker of something, maybe doubt, maybe reluctance. The prosecutor still wasn't backing down. "That may prove some differences, but it doesn't eliminate the possibility that he was involved. Perhaps he changed shoes. Perhaps." Angela cut him off. "Perhaps you're grasping at straws because you know this case is built on bias and nothing more." A hush fell over the room. Malik swallowed hard. His mother was standing toe-to-toe with people who wanted nothing more than to make him another statistic, another lost case. But she wasn't going to let that happen. The judge exhaled through his nose. "I will review the evidence. Court is adjourned for now." The gavel slammed down. People began murmuring, some reporters whispering into their microphones, their cameras capturing every moment. As Malik and his mother made their way out of the courtroom, a man in a gray suit approached them. He had sharp eyes, an air of quiet authority. "Miss Johnson," he said smoothly, extending a hand. "Agent Collins, FBI. I'd like to speak with you privately." Angela glanced at Malik before nodding. "About what?" Agent Collins lowered his voice. "There's something you need to see." They followed him into a quiet room down the hall. The agent shut the door and pulled out a thin file from his briefcase. He slid it across the table. Angela opened it, her expression shifting as she scanned the contents. Malik tried to read her face, but she was too good at keeping her emotions locked away. Finally, she spoke. This is the real suspect." Collins nodded. "We've had our eye on him for a while. A known offender. The physical description matches the person in the video almost perfectly." Malik felt his breath catch. "Then why was I arrested?" The agent hesitated. "Because someone wanted you to be." Angela's head snapped up. "What are you saying?" Collins folded his hands. "We've been investigating misconduct in the local police department and judiciary. Your son's case raised some flags. Someone deliberately pushed this case forward, despite weak evidence. And based on what we found, it wasn't just negligence, it was intentional. Malik's stomach twisted. Angela's expression darkened. Who? The agent hesitated again, then pulled out another document. He slid it toward them. Angela read it. Her fingers tightened around the paper. Judge Pierce. Malik's throat went dry. The judge. Collins nodded. We believe he's been involved in multiple cases like this. Unjust rulings, disproportionately targeting certain defendants. Your son's case was just the latest. Angela's voice was cold, so this wasn't just about incompetence. This was about power. Malik clenched his fists. He had felt it in that courtroom, the way the judge looked at him, like he had already decided his fate before he even stepped through the doors. But now, knowing it was more than just bias, more than just a mistake, it made his blood boil. Angela turned to Collins. What happens now? Collins leaned back. We're still gathering evidence. But if we move too soon, we risk alerting him. We need to be sure we have everything before we act. Angela closed the folder, her jaw tight. And in the meantime, my son is still facing trial. He's still being dragged through this system while the real criminal is out there. Collins hesitated. I know this is difficult, but we need to tread carefully. If we expose the judge now, without solid proof, it could backfire. Angela took a deep breath. Then we need to get that proof. Malik watched his mother, the fire in her eyes burning stronger than ever. He had seen her fight battles before, but this was something different. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about justice. For him. For everyone who had been caught in the same web of corruption. And one way or another, they were going to bring it all down. The courtroom was packed. Reporters lined the aisles, cameras flashing as the tension in the air grew thicker by the second. Malik sat beside his mother, his hands clenched together on the table. Angela was calm, her face unreadable, but Malik knew better. Beneath her composed expression, she was holding back a storm. Judge Pierce entered, his robe flowing behind him as he took his seat. His expression was neutral, but Malik caught the way his fingers tapped lightly against the bench. Nervous, maybe even anxious. He knew something was coming. The prosecutor stood. Your Honor, we are ready to proceed with the trial. Before he could say another word, Angela stood. Your Honor, before we continue, I'd like to submit new evidence into the record. A murmur spread through the courtroom. The judge adjusted his glasses. Ms. Johnson, we are well into these proceedings. What possible evidence could justify an interruption at this stage? Angela didn't flinch. She turned and nodded. The doors at the back of the courtroom opened. Agent Collins walked in, flanked by 2 officers. But they weren't just any officers. They were federal agents. And they weren't alone. Behind them was a man in cuffs, his head slightly bowed. The entire courtroom gasped. The real suspect. The prosecutor hesitated. He wasn't used to being questioned like this. Usually, no one in Malik's position had someone powerful enough to demand anything. But this wasn't a usual case anymore. Malik's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. His mom was here. She was already shifting the power in the room. But that didn't mean they were safe yet. He could still feel the fight in the air, the judge's resistance, the prosecutor's discomfort. The cracks were forming, but they hadn't broken through yet. Judge Pierce glanced at the clock, then at the jury. He looked like a man trapped in a game he no longer controlled. I believe we've had enough for today, he announced abruptly. Court will reconvene tomorrow morning. He slammed the gavel down before anyone could argue. And just like that, it was over for now. Malik exhaled, his muscles aching from how tense he had been. He turned in his seat, his eyes meeting his mother's for the first time. She gave him a small, reassuring nod. But he knew her well enough to see what was behind it. This wasn't over, not even close. As the courtroom emptied, Malik stood up slowly, his legs still feeling stiff from sitting so long. His mother made her way toward him, her face still composed, but he could see the fire in her eyes. The moment she reached him, she placed a firm hand on his shoulder, a silent reassurance. "We're going to fix this," she murmured, her voice calm but laced with something sharper. Determination, maybe even anger. Malik swallowed hard. He wanted to believe her. He needed to believe her. But the weight of everything that had happened still pressed against his chest. The prosecutor was gathering his papers at the other end of the room, speaking in hushed tones to his assistant. Malik noticed how they kept glancing in his mother's direction, their body language tense. The judge had already retreated to his chambers, but not before giving Angela Johnson one last measured look before disappearing behind the heavy wooden door. Malik's public defender, Mr. Reeves, cleared his throat. "Miss Johnson, I have to say, I think your presence is already making a difference." He sounded almost relieved. Angela's expression didn't change. It should have never come to this. Her tone was even, but Malik knew her well enough to hear the restrained fury beneath it. They walked out of the courtroom together, the eyes of reporters flashing toward them the moment they stepped into the hallway. The air was thick with murmurs, cameras clicking, people whispering. Some reporters started throwing out questions, but Angela ignored them, keeping her focus on Malik. "Come on," she said, leading him toward the exit. Once outside, Malik took a deep breath, filling his lungs with fresh air. It didn't feel as freeing as he hoped. The tension was still there, knotting his stomach, making his fingers tremble slightly. His mother noticed and gently squeezed his arm. "We're going to break this down piece by piece," she said. "But first, we need to go over exactly what they have on you." They got into the sleek black car waiting for them at the curb. The moment the doors shut, Malik let out a long breath and finally spoke. "They don't have anything real," he said, his voice quieter than he meant it to be. "It's all just assumptions. I was wearing black, and the guy in the video was wearing black. That's it. That's all they have." Angela's jaw tightened. She looked out the window for a moment, her fingers drumming lightly against her knee. Then she turned to him. "They were hoping you wouldn't fight back," she said. "That you wouldn't have anyone to fight back for you." Malik swallowed hard. He knew she was right. If she hadn't shown up, if she hadn't been who she was, would anyone have believed him? Would anyone have even listened? The car ride was quiet after that, but the silence wasn't comfortable. It was charged, heavy with everything that had happened, and everything still coming. As they stepped out of the courtroom into the bright afternoon light, Malik turned to his mom. "What happens now?" Angela looked ahead, her jaw set. "Now we make sure this never happens again." And for the first time in weeks, Malik smiled. Malik walked out of the courthouse beside his mother, the weight of everything that had happened still pressing on his chest. The sky was clear, the sun shining down as if the universe itself knew that justice had finally been served. But even as the fresh air filled his lungs, he knew this was far from over. Just because one judge had been exposed didn't mean the whole system had changed. Reporters rushed toward them, cameras flashing, microphones shoved forward as voices overlapped with questions. "Madam Attorney General, what will happen to Judge Pierce now?" "Malik, how do you feel after being framed for a crime you didn't commit? Do you think this case will lead to bigger investigations?" Angela stopped, placing a hand on Malik's back as she faced the crowd. Her voice was steady, commanding, yet calm. "The justice system is built on the trust of the people. Today, we took a step toward restoring that trust, but this is just the beginning. No one, no matter their position, should be above the law. As they made their way to the car, Malik finally let out a breath he didn't even realize he'd been holding. His mom glanced at him. "You okay?" He nodded. "I think so." Then, after a pause, "It's just, I thought when this was over, I'd feel relieved. But now, I just feel like there's so much more to do." Angela gave him a small smile. "That's how you know you're paying attention." The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Judge Pierce was formally charged with corruption, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy. As more investigations unfolded, other names surfaced. People who had worked alongside him, covering up cases, manipulating evidence, and destroying lives for their own gain. The fallout was bigger than anyone had expected, shaking the legal community to its core. Malik's case became national news. He was invited to interviews, asked to speak at events, and suddenly his name was everywhere. But the strangest part was how many people reached out to him. People who had gone through the same thing, but never had the chance to fight back. People who had lost years of their lives to false accusations and unfair sentences. One day, while sitting in his room scrolling through messages, he came across a letter from a man named Darnell Carter. He had spent 10 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. No evidence, just a judge and a prosecutor who wanted a conviction. He wrote, "Seeing you fight back gave me hope that maybe someone will finally listen to us." Malik stared at the message for a long time. It wasn't just about him anymore. His mom walked in, setting down a cup of tea on his desk. "You're thinking hard about something," she observed. He looked up at her. "I want to help." Angela sat on the edge of his bed. "You already have." Malik shook his head. "No, I mean really help. There are so many people like me, but they don't have someone like you to fight for them. What if we did something? Like a project or a foundation or something to help people who've been wrongfully accused." His mother studied him for a moment, then smiled. "That's not a bad idea." Within months, Malik and Angela launched an initiative aimed at providing legal support for wrongfully accused individuals, working with law students, lawyers, and activists who wanted to make a difference. The media followed their efforts, turning Malik into a symbol of resilience and justice. But to him, it wasn't about recognition. It was about making sure no one else had to sit in a courtroom feeling as helpless as he once had. One afternoon, as he walked into their office, he noticed a framed picture on his mom's desk. It was an old one from when he was just a kid. In the photo, Angela was sitting at a desk, stacks of legal books in front of her, Malik in her lap, scribbling on a notepad with a crayon. "You always knew I'd end up doing this, didn't you?" he joked. Angela chuckled. "Let's just say I had a feeling." Malik sat down, looking at the growing list of cases they were reviewing. It was overwhelming, knowing how many people still needed help. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel powerless. He felt ready. As he glanced out the window at the city below, he thought about everything that had happened. The fear, the uncertainty, the moment when it seemed like all hope was lost. And then the fight. The truth. The victory. This was just the beginning. Because justice wasn't about one case. It was about all of them. And Malik wasn't going to stop until every person who had been silenced finally had a voice.